All right, friends. I'm bringing you something really special today after lunch. Yeah, I know. Thank you for the cheering, Stephen. I think so. It's really unusual that you get a superstar as the after lunch panel. But I'm bringing you Karen Howe. She's a best-selling author. She's an award-winning technology journalist. Her work sits at the intersection of AI, power, and accountability. She was the first journalist ever to profile OpenAI. And her 2025 book, which is why she is here today, it's what she's talking about today, The Empire of AI, is a New York Times bestseller. Her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, and she leads the Pulitzer Center's AI Spotlight series, which trains journalists all over the world to cover AI critically. Before this, she was a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal on AI and a senior AI editor at the MI Technology Review. She received her degree in mechanical engineering from MIT as a Caltech grad. She's still welcome.
Where's Charles?
Yeah. But I think I'm really excited. Karen, there's a whole group of people in this room who've been asking questions about ethical and responsible AI use. And so the audience that you're speaking today is a group of technologists and a group of county election officials who are really wondering about the questions of like how they can and should be using AI. And so I think your work is going to really speak to their questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, great. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Well, thank you so much for the amazing intro, and thank you all for having me here. I was a very last-minute addition to the agenda because I was actually just on campus doing my book tour event, and it just so happened that this conference was happening at the same time. So I'm really honored to be spending some time with you this afternoon. So as Betsy mentioned, I wanted to spend our brief time today to give you a preview of my book, Empire of AI. It tells the inside story of OpenAI, and it uses that as a lens to revisit the history of AI, the wide-reaching present-day impacts of this technology, and to argue for a different path of AI development in the future. Today, I'm going to skip the corporate drama, and I encourage you to buy a copy of the book to read that. And I'm going to go straight into the most important question that courses through the book, which is, I think, what all of us are gathered here to just discuss. How do we govern artificial intelligence to maximize the benefits to society while minimizing its harms? Part of the challenge of talking about AI today is the complete lack of specificity in the term artificial intelligence. I'm sure a lot of the AI researchers in this room really feel this. And the analogy that I often use is AI is like the word transportation. You could be referring to a bicycle or a rocket or an electric train or a gas-guzzling truck. And they're obviously different forms of transportation, but they also serve different purposes and they have different cost-benefit trade-offs. We don't talk about AI in this way, but we should talk about AI in this way because AI refers to such a wide variety of different technologies. So when we talk about maximizing its benefits, we can't just ask, do we want more AI? We need to ask, which AI technologies do we need more of? Which ones should we have less of? And how do we continue improving existing and designing new forms of AI in which the benefits outweigh the harms? And I'd argue that the kinds of AI systems that dominate our headlines and our imagination today, large-scale, quote-unquote, general-purpose systems like ChatGPT, represent the worst trade-offs in the portfolio of existing AI technologies. I think they exact an extraordinary cost on large swaths of society, and they ultimately accrue benefit to a tiny group at the top, which is why I call these companies developing these systems empires of AI. They act exactly like empires of old, and I talk about 4 different parallels in my book. First, they lay claim to resources that are not their own, but they reinterpret the rules to suggest that those resources were always their own. That refers to the data that they scrape from the internet, saying that it's totally free and in the public domain, the intellectual property of artists, writers, and creators, saying that it's totally fair use under copyright law. Second, they exploit an extraordinary amount of labor, both workers who make critical contributions to the wealth creation of these companies but see very little of that wealth creation in return, as well as workers who get their jobs automated away by the technology itself. Third, they monopolize knowledge production. So we've seen most AI researchers in the world start migrating from academia to the AI industry because the AI industry is able to pay much higher salaries. And then these companies are able to exert a significant amount of controlling influence on the research that is actually published. So we are seeing a distortion in the fundamental AI science, the way that we might see as distortion if most climate scientists were bankrolled by the fossil fuel industry. We would not get a clear picture of the climate emergency, and we are not getting a clear picture of the true capabilities and limitations of these large-scale models. Fourth and finally, these companies justify their actions, as all empires do, with a moral and existential imperative. They are the good empire on a civilizing mission to bring progress and modernity to all of humanity. And if we just follow them and allow them unfettered access to all of these resources, they are going to elevate us to an AI heaven. But if they lose to the evil empire, and I talk in my book about how OpenAI in the early days conceives of Google as the evil empire, now increasingly Silicon Valley conceives of China as the evil empire. If the evil empire gets to the technology first, then humanity is on its path to destruction, and we will end up in an AI hell. So my critique of today's dominant systems really boils down to this, their scale. And what I mean by the scale is, of course, the size of the data sets for training a single AI system, as well as the amount of computational resources or compute being used to perform that training. Both of these charts are in logarithmic scale. So not only are we seeing an exponential increase in both data and compute, but a far faster acceleration of their scaling than ever before. You see the slope popping up in both charts in the last few years. And here's a different way of looking at it through OpenAI's technologies. In 4 years between 2019 and 2023, OpenAI scaled its GPT models more than 10,000 times. So that's 10,000 times more data, 10,000 times more compute being used to train a single system. And in reporting my book, I found that in order to achieve this scale, just when it comes to the training data quantity, OpenAI dramatically dropped its standards for data quality, as well as its regard for intellectual property. So whereas OpenAI used curated articles and websites for GPT-2, it started pirating books and indiscriminately scraping the internet, as well as transcribing YouTube videos against YouTube's terms of service to get the amount of data it needed for GPT-4. This is the same story for all of the main AI model developers. And so if we were to summarize the harms of aggressively scaling training data, you are talking about problems like infringements on data privacy, the erosion of intellectual property, the perpetuation of an engagement-centric model of social media. We are increasingly getting evidence that these companies are making their technologies more and more addictive so that they can continue to harvest more data from their users. More polluted data sets, which then leads to this problem of labor exploitation. Because when you are training your models on the internet, and the internet has a lot of dark corners, you now have to deal with the problem of content moderation. And so in my book, I traveled to Kenya to meet with the workers that OpenAI contracted to perform this content moderation. Specifically, the workers were asked to build a content moderation filter that OpenAI could wrap around its models to block problematic generations from ever reaching their users. And what that meant for the workers is they had to wade through some of the worst content on the internet, as well as AI-generated content where OpenAI was prompting its models to imagine the worst content on the internet. The workers then had to put this into a detailed taxonomy. Is this hate speech, harassment, violent content, sexual content? What is the severity of that content? Does that sexual content involve abuse? Does that abuse involve children? And in the end, this content moderation filter was crucial for OpenAI becoming a household name overnight, because it is what allowed ChatGPT to go viral and continue being viral. If some of you might remember, in 2016, Microsoft tried to put a chatbot out called Tay that did not have this content moderation, and it immediately had to be taken down because of how quickly it started spewing abusive speech at users. But I want you to hear what this work also did to the workers themselves. This is Alex Cairo. He was 28 years old when I interviewed him for a podcast for the Wall Street Journal. He was on the violent content team for this project with OpenAI, which meant that he was reading and labeling scenarios like murders, stabbings, and self-harm. And I realized I did not check whether the audio works, so let's see what happens. So when you would go home at night, like what would you think about after 8 hours of reading all of that stuff?
Oh, my mental state was very bad. I had nightmares. I feared people. Maybe I see too many people coming. I see violence. If I see someone holding a fork or a razor blade, I see people cutting himself or something like that. At night, I will dream. I will have nightmares. Even I'll tell my brother, okay, just come here, sit with me like for 5 hours before I go to sleep, because I need someone to talk to before I go to sleep, because if I go to sleep, I'll start screaming or something like that. So many things are going a lot in my mind, yeah.
So that just is the harms that come out of scaling the training data. But now we also have to deal with the problem of scaling compute, which is leading to a whole other set of unprecedented challenges. That includes accelerated mineral extraction, increased energy and fresh water consumption, utility price hikes. Bloomberg actually just came out with an investigation just a couple weeks ago showing how utility prices have dramatically increased across the US, sometimes up to 200% in the last 5 years due to data center development. Strain on grid infrastructure. A US regulator just warned over the summer that data centers are threatening the reliability of grids, and greater carbon emissions. A June report from the UN just found that 4 of the leading AI companies increased their emissions by 150% since 2020 because of the data center development. And that was exactly the year that these companies promised to bring their carbon emissions down to 0 by the end of the decade. So what is the scale that we're actually talking about? Per a recent McKinsey report, in the conservative scenario, data centers could need as much energy as 2 states of California by the end of the decade. In an accelerated scenario, it could need as much as 6. And aside from the escalating energy demands, data centers need fresh water to cool. Not all data centers need fresh water to cool, but the ones who need water to cool, it has to be fresh water. And it has to be fresh water because any other type of water leads to bacterial growth or corrosion of the equipment. And another investigation this year, Bloomberg found that 2/3 of these data centers are going into water-stressed areas globally. And it's actually also increasing over time. The proportion of water-stressed areas is increasing over time. So there are people in the world who are actively competing with these pieces of infrastructure for life-sustaining resources. In my book, I write about one of these communities in Montevideo, Uruguay, which I initially learned about from this article in The Guardian. Residents were facing such a historic drought that the Montevideo government was literally mixing salt water into the public drinking water supply just to have something come out of people's taps. And for people who could not afford to buy bottled water, this is the water that they were drinking. So women were having higher rates of miscarriages. Elderly people were experiencing intensified chronic illnesses. And in the middle of this huge public health crisis, Google proposed to build a data center in Montevideo and use the scarce fresh water to cool it. And if you think, well, these impacts are far away, actually, St. Louis is in the middle of a huge battle around data centers right now. There's one proposed data center that could use as much energy as 13,000 homes, roughly the number of homes as 3 major neighborhoods in the St. Louis area combined: Shaw, Tower Grove South, and Tower Grove East. And as the government has been pushing this narrative that it's going to help revitalize St. Louis and turn it into an innovation hub, residents have been seriously concerned about what this will ultimately mean for their utility bills, whether they will still have clean, fresh water, and they're demanding to better understand whether there are truly going to be long-term economic benefits from this data center rather than just resource extraction. So this is the extraordinary part to me, is that this scale is actually completely unnecessary. You do not actually need this degree of data compute to reap the benefits of AI development. We've already seen evidence of this with models like DeepSeek, where it is possible to develop the same capabilities with significantly less computation. And that doesn't account for the full range of other AI systems that already exist that have nothing to do with large-scale generative systems and are hugely beneficial. Nor does it account for the new techniques that could be developed with more fundamental research that could bring even more benefit at less cost. And in fact, I would argue that the scaling approach is not bringing us innovation, but rather costing us innovation. In the first quarter of this year, nearly half of all venture money went into two companies, OpenAI and Anthropic. So the scaling approach is eating up a huge share of the capital, not just for investing in other types of AI approaches, but pretty much any other types of technologies. There was another story earlier this year that showed that investments in climate tech is declining because those VCs are now shifting their capital to these scaling labs. So what should we actually be doing instead? First, I think we need to stop scaling. We should urgently be shifting away from these general purpose large-scale systems and reinvest in small, task-specific AI systems that tackle challenges that lend themselves to the strengths of advanced computation. Things like computational biology. Think DeepMind's AlphaFold. Ultimately, DeepMind's AlphaFold was able to predict with high accuracy the protein folding structure from an amino acid sequence, and this is a crucial first step to understanding human disease, as well as accelerating drug discovery. It won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry last year. And this is a system that was not trained on the internet, which meant that it did not involve content moderation. It did not involve colossal supercomputers. And so the costs of producing this model are dramatically orders of magnitude smaller than something like ChatGPT and had a profound contribution to scientific knowledge. Another example, climate change mitigation solutions. As detailed and documented by the nonprofit Climate Change AI, this is a nonprofit that I really love. That's a group of top AI researchers around the world that have done the hard work of cataloging all of the different leverage points that they see AI having on the accelerating climate crisis. And all of these leverage points are, once again, they lend themselves to benefiting from some kind of advanced computation. And then they list all of the different AI technologies that would be involved in tackling that problem, and none of them have anything to do with large-scale generative models or general-purpose models. They have everything to do with the small, task-specific AI systems. So this is things like better weather prediction, more renewable energy integration onto the grid, optimizing supply chains, improving energy storage solutions, reducing the energy consumption of buildings and of city environments. Second, we need to invest in independent fundamental AI research, not driven by the agenda of these companies, but driven by what is in the public interest, to figure out what goes in this box with a question mark. So what are the alternative AI futures that we can build that fortify and strengthen democratic institutions, that improve our climate situation, that help give people more jobs rather than less jobs, all of the big challenges that we ultimately want to solve to make the world a better place. So I finished writing my book before President Trump came back into power, and I honestly could not have guessed that my analogy to historical empires would become even more relevant. Trump has made abundantly clear that he is willing to put the full force of Washington behind Silicon Valley. And we are now seeing, I think, a modern-day reprisal of the British East India Company abetted in its reckless expansion by the British Crown. At this point, the empires of AI, you could argue, have become more powerful than any nation state. And if we continue down this path, the consequence will not just be labor exploitation, environmental fallout, public health crisis. If we return to the age of empire, democracy will not survive. But there is hope. This is a Chilean environmental activist group called Moscat. In 2019, they discovered a Google plan to build a data center in the town of Cerrillos, right outside of Santiago, that could use 1,000 times more fresh water than the residents. Chile was in the middle of a historic mega drought. So Mossack found this plan unacceptable. And they immediately mobilized. They knocked on all of their neighbors' doors, handed out flyers at street corners, educated everyone, including the local government, about the impact that this data center could have on the community's fresh water. And they were so effective that they actually stalled the project for 5 years. And in the end, not only did Google make a concession to stop using fresh water for cooling their data center, the Chilean government also created a roundtable of tech companies, activists, and local residents to consult for future data center projects. Mossack's movements has since inspired movements around the world. Dozens of communities are mobilizing against extractive data centers. They're stalling projects that are not helping them, getting companies and governments to pay attention. And that includes the movements right here in St. Louis, in the town over. There was a data center that was proposed. The entire community rallied up against it in St. Charles, and they actually implemented a ban on data centers after the democratic process played out. And these data center movements are not alone. There are many other movements that are building up as people are starting to push back against the empires of AI. Artists and writers are suing these companies for taking their intellectual property. Workers are striking against AI-enabled labor exploitation. Citizens are pushing on their governments to establish legislation and regulation around AI use. And entrepreneurs, researchers, investors are starting to look at what are the new types of AI systems that they should be shifting their resources to. So how do we actually build a better world? To me, my theory of change used to be about top-down governance. I no longer think that's sufficient. I think we need bottoms-up governance. We need collective action from the ground up. That refers to all the movements that I described, also local elected officials doing the work of what the federal government is unwilling to do. And I see all of these movements and all of this activity as forms of democratic contestation pushing against the empires along their AI development supply chain. So I hope that if you take one thing away from this talk, that every single one of you, regardless of what institution you sit at, what role you play, you have an active role in shaping technology development and resisting empire and fortifying our collective future. Because at the end of the day, while empires are made to feel inevitable, history has shown us that when people rise, empires always fall. Thank you.
Karen's going to take her own questions, but I'm going to run the mic around.
Great. Okay. First question over here.
Please introduce yourselves.
Don Palmer, Election Assistance Commission with the federal government. I'm just so
Welcome. Thank you so much for coming to my talk.
exactly. Hashtag Empire. My question is so just reading the news, you see there's so much focus on this, right? Mm-hmm. And so when you step back, you see the number of investment and fairly smart people that say we need to invest so much into AI and this is the future. You start to believe that it's necessary to who controls the economies of the world and information. What is that? Is that true? Is that why folks are investing so much money in this, or is it just pure profit? It's either us or the Chinese who are going to take the big checks home.
Yeah, most of the people that are like going all in saying we have to invest everything are deeply financially conflicted for sure. So there is definitely a profit element. But the other thing that was most surprising to me when I was reporting the book is the degree to which quasi-religious movements have developed within Silicon Valley around what AI is and what it will ultimately mean for us. And what I'm talking about is that they believe that artificial general intelligence, this AI, theoretical AI system that will be as smart as humans, is possible, imminent, and going to have some cataclysmically major transformation on civilization, either in the positive or negative direction. Either it will bring us to utopia or it'll kill everyone. And I think a lot of the activity around we need to continue investing is also an ideological drive, not just profit. Like the people who genuinely believe that this is possible and on the horizon think that there's absolutely nothing else we should be investing in the world. But the problem is that this is not, the reason why I call it a quasi-religious movement is because it's not actually based in scientific evidence that these systems are possible and imminent. In fact, 75% of long-standing AI researchers just earlier this year said in a survey that they don't think that we have the existing techniques to reach artificial general intelligence. The path of like scale, scale, scale is not actually going to get us there, and they're actually not even sure if we're ever going to get there at all. And so I think there is this belief that is pushing people towards this, but it's also just really convenient for the companies that have the profit motive as well to fuel and fan the flames of this narrative, because what it allows them to do is they've now consolidated more capital, more land, more energy, more freshwater resources, more data than any company has in history under the guise of doing this work.
Hey, I'm Mike Alvarez from Caltech. I'm one of the co-organizers of this conference with Betsy, and I wanted to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I loved the book. I read it about 2 months ago.
Thank
the
you.
Boomers Doomers story is fantastic. So if anybody wants to read the book, there's this great story about the fight inside OpenAI, which I'd love to hear more about, but that's not my point of my question. What I struggled with a little bit was the conclusion.
Yeah.
And the call for action.
Yeah.
In particular, I love the idea of democratizing the process and decentralizing models and building decentralized models, in particular for marginalized communities where it can really matter. Mm-hmm. However, marginalized communities need a way to capture the data necessary to train the models. And I was really wondering if you could speak a little bit more in concrete terms as to how people in this room who might want to help can really help marginalized communities build these kind of models, and how to capture the data they need to train the models.
Yeah, that is a great question. So, I mean, in the epilogue where I talk about this conclusion, I talk about the example of this group called Tahiku Media, which was an organization, nonprofit media organization in New Zealand that is broadcasts in Te Reo Māori, the language of the Maori people. And like many indigenous peoples around the world, the Maori almost lost that language because of colonization policies that instituted that they were only allowed to learn English instead of their own language. And so there's been this big movement to revitalize that language, and Tahiku Media thought, what better way to contribute to that than to open up our archive of all of these people speaking our language so that language learners can hear those sounds and have like in some kind of interactive app where they're learning as they're hearing. But one of the challenges that they faced was needing to transcribe the audio so that in the app, someone can listen and then see the words that are being spoken, and then they can click on the words and get a definition or a translation. And they just didn't have enough speakers, Te Reo Māori speakers, to do that transcription work. And so they turned to designing a bespoke AI speech recognition tool. And they turned to the community, and first and foremost, they were like, do you want this speech recognition tool? And it was only when the community said yes that they then did an AI literacy campaign where they helped people understand, okay, in order for this tool to come into existence, we need data. And they engaged in basically a community data collection drive where they created a competition around it, and they made it really fun. And within days, they got all the data that they needed from the community. And part of it was the community buy-in and the trust that this organization, if they gave their data, the organization would continue to keep the data in ways that aligned with the community's values. But the other thing is, because this was a really small speech recognition tool, you don't actually need a lot of data. I made a comparison in the book, I don't remember it anymore, but like the number of hours that they had versus the number of hours OpenAI used to train Whisper, which is also a speech recognition tool, is of a completely different proportion, because OpenAI was trying to do it through the transformer architecture, which is like a really inefficient way to develop speech recognition tool, whereas this group was doing it through like more task-specific AI approaches. And so I see this as a model for more of these marginalized communities getting access to technologies that serve them. And there are lots of organizations that are starting to do this work very similar to Tahiku Media. I'm a big fan of DARE, Distributed AI Research Institute, which is run by Timnit Gebru, who was originally the ethical AI co-lead at Google and then was fired. And her institute does exactly the same kind of community-based work where all of the researchers will go to communities, ask them, what are the challenges that you typically face that are major blockers to having like a higher quality of life? And then they try to figure out, is there actually anything that AI could help solve? And sometimes the answer is no. But when the answer is yes, then they work with the community to collect the data. They help educate the community on what kind of data needs there would be, and then they sort of figure out where they can do this in a completely consentful way so that everyone understands where their data is going and what it's going to be used for. And I think this is just a model that we need to see more and more and more of, these more small, bespoke, localized models that really can have like community governance, where the community is like involved in the full life cycle of the development and the deployment of the technology.
I have time for like 2 more questions.
Stephen Richer, Harvard Kennedy School. The question is, why doesn't the market solve this? The provocation is, you say venture capital is investing in firms that use a lot of resources but provide little value, and that there are firms that use few resources but provide highly significant value. So why are venture capital firms not investing in the low resources, high value firms?
In part because the value is not always economic. So that's, I mean, like, integrating more renewable energy onto the grid is not necessarily of high economic value, but of course it's of high societal value. But the other thing is, I think Meredith Whittaker, the president of Signal, talks about this really eloquently. Like, the model of VC is hype. So they've hyped up the capabilities of this technology, and they've presented those capabilities as on the horizon, not necessarily, like, we're not necessarily seeing it in the present day, but it's just around the corner. And so I think they've successfully made a lot of people believe that we're not seeing economic value now for the large scale systems, but that it will occur soon, and that they should just continue holding out. But I think there's going to be a huge market correction in like the next couple of years, yeah, because they won't be able to hold out that much longer.
I'm going to let Dan have the last question, and then you have to buy this book, my friends.
I have this book. I started reading it. It's wonderful. Thank you. I love your
you.
signature, but that's not my question. My question is, so I'm Dan Rainen from WashU. I help lead AI and engineering here. And I'm looking at different tools for Washington University. One of them is OpenAI EDU. A large number of universities have already signed up with them. Mm-hmm. And there are these contracts that basically say they won't use their data, our data, to train their model. You've just proven that they don't actually, they seem to disregard copyright law. I'm a technologist, I'm not a lawyer, so yeah. Who knows? Do you have any advice for these universities who are going to potentially give them their intellectual data? Like, do you have concerns? Should we have concerns? Or are these contracts actually ironclad and they will never use our data to train their new GPT-6 model?
I have huge concerns, and my advice is don't enter these partnerships. I tell the same thing to media organizations that are trying, they also license their articles to these companies. Like, I sometimes write for The Atlantic. The Atlantic has a partnership with OpenAI, and after that partnership was signed, I kind of stopped writing for The Atlantic. But yeah, like, I just don't, like, obviously they are at some point going to start training on this data, because Altman just said 3 days ago he wants to build 250 gigawatts of data center capacity by 2033, which is like 5 gigawatts is the entirety of New York City. So that's 50 New York cities of supercomputers. And he predicted that it's going to cost like $10 trillion, which is like higher than the national deficit. I mean, this is an insane amount. And based on how they scale, there's this proportional relationship between compute and data. So they're planning on building $10 trillion worth of compute. I mean, they're planning on finding an extraordinary amount more data to pump into these systems for training. And so how are they not, like, this is extremely high quality data that media organizations and universities are offering. And so I would say use the open source models, like in whatever way you can, especially for institutions that have technical capacity, like use the model where your data does not enter the company's server, right? And yes, it will be more annoying. Yes, these applications are way more like OpenAI makes it just like really consumer friendly, but it's worth that extra annoyance in the beginning, the extra setup cost to create something that's basically more sovereign. Like you will have more control afterwards of your data and of the AI system as well and how it works.
I need everyone to thank Karen.